My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, and today I'm interviewing two authors. One of the authors is a Hungarian art critic and cultural critic, Ilona Sármány Parsons, who has just got a new book out which we'll be discussing in a moment. The other author is Nicholas T. Parsons, who has got a book out entitled Civilization and its Malcontents. These two authors happen to be married to each other. Ilona is Hungarian, Nick is English. They live in both countries. And our meeting today is therefore also a meeting of cultures. And I hope to explore the nature of the English culture, English-speaking culture, and the nature of Hungarian culture in the next hour with both of them. Ilona, Nick, thank you very much for coming. And Ilona, I'm going to begin with you. The first thing I want to ask you is, what is the title of your book and what are you covering in it?
The title of the book is Art Life in Vienna in the Age of Ferenc József, as Ludwig Hevesi saw it.
And who was Ludwig Hevesi?
Ludwig Hevesi was an art critic who wrote about theater, books, and first and foremost about art exhibitions from 1869 up to his death, 1910, in Vienna. But he was of Hungarian origin. He moved to Vienna only in 1875, and that he moved there was partly a matter of the heart. He followed his great love, Tina Blau, who didn't bother much about him, but who was a paintress. And Hevesi got a very good job at the very important newspaper, the Fremdenblatt in Vienna, which was the semi-official daily of the Foreign Ministry of Vienna. And this was that newspaper which Ferenc József read first each morning when he got up at 4:30. Because he was actually not only the head of the state, but he was the foreign minister of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this was his paper. It didn't have a very big circulation, only 10,000 people read it, but those who had to read it were the bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, and the aristocracy, the court members. All the influential people of the time read at first this paper, and only after it the mass publications like the Wiener Zeitung or the other newspapers. So it was a very important position if somebody could be a journalist in this paper. And Hevesi, who came over to Vienna with a Hungarian lobby, because Rand Andrássy, who became the foreign minister of the monarchy in 1973, there were quite a lot of very talented, upward mobile Hungarians, partly Jewish, like Hevesi, who were totally assimilated and who were for the monarchy and for their native country, Hungary.
So you're describing, in effect, one of the early stages of the great influence of journalism in Europe. And I think we see the same thing, of course, in England. So how did he make reputations? Whose reputations did he make? And what was his overall impact on the art world in Vienna?
When he moved to Vienna, he was already writing journalism since 1967. So he had a very good know-how already, and what's most important, he was extremely cultured. He was that type of workaholic person who read about 18 hours a day, I think, but his big passion was the fine arts, pictures, you know. He traveled all around Europe, spoke 6 languages, could read English, French, German naturally, Italian, even Spanish a bit, and of course Hungarian, his native language. And at that time, the Latin and Greek basis was offered such a great knowledge, historical knowledge about the fine arts too, iconography, that he could have been a professor at the university on the basis of his knowledge. But he was very humble. and he was very curious of anything new. And exactly these two characteristics, the giant knowledge and the openness, was what made him unique among the other art critics. Plus, that he was not specializing only on one branches of the art, because he was a passionate theater goer too, that gave him a plus background about the contemporary literature, or actually I would say about European literature going back to the antiques, because his favorite authors were at first the Greek authors, you know. So this basis was unrivalable by the others. And he became very soon a great authority. He interpreted his own job at first as a kind of teacher, professor, to educate the public what's good and what's not good in the fine arts, you know. But he was open. Any novelty which he sensed, and he had an inner eye which is born with you for the aesthetic quality, that can be learned too. It must be also learned, but you have instincts too. And his instinct in that aspect, what's good quality in art, was unmatchable. Even in the obituaries, even his enemies, who supported later different lobbies, acknowledged this fantastic characteristic of Hevesi. Now he was a master of the word too. His articles are very sensual. And your other question, because I spoke about him only now, but whom he supported Macquart, he supported the greatest landscapist of the time, Schindler, for example. He supported Gustav Klimt, and what's more, he made Gustav Klimt actually the greatest figure of the secession. And beside it, he had one great love, all his lifetime, a man who was the greatest watercolorist, aquarellist of Vienna, who was much older than he could have been his grandfather, but who lived nearly as long as Hevesi lived, Rudolf von Alt. And the cover of my book is exactly an Alt watercolor of Vienna. Hevesi came from Budapest, but loved Vienna very much too, as a very aesthetic city, and he became rooted into the Viennese culture, and he was an eminence gris, actually, for that culture.
I want to move on for the moment to Nick and ask you about your book. Civilization and its Malcontents, of course, a play on Freud's civilization and its discontents. Would you like to try to give us a picture of, large general picture of what the book is about?
It is a collection of essays and review articles on the model of what you perhaps traditionally would read, say, in the Times Literary Supplement or that kind of a journal, which is, to be honest, not a very fashionable genre now, but has a long and in England a very distinguished tradition, and sometimes essays have been, quite short historical essays have been influential. In my case, as Freud, of course, was concerned with the sexual repression that led to civilization's discontents. I don't want to disappoint readers in advance, but there is no sex, please, we're British, as the old comedy title was, so there's no sex in the book. But I hope that it is in some respects politically sexy. And why do I say that? Because I believe that we, at the moment, are in the throes of what the Germans call a Kulturkampf. But it's a bit different. It is an attempt to monopolize and take over much of our culture by left liberal ideology. And I have explored different aspects of that in the essays here. But there are also pieces about Hungary. There's a piece about fashion. There is a piece about the commodification of art. Phenomena which, on the whole, I'm afraid I look at with a disapproving eye and sometimes an ironic one.
And there's a good deal of several essays about Hungarian history and the creation of the the revival of the Hungarian nation in the last century. What is now
there is a long
2 centuries ago.
Yes, there is a longish piece about my hero, if you like, of Hungarian history, who is Count István Széchenyi, which I contributed to a memorial volume about which marked centenary, I suppose. Dual centenary of the creation of the Lánchíd, the chain bridge. We happen to know the descendant of Adam Clark, who was what was known in Scotland as a lad of Perth. That is to say, he came from a relatively humble background, but he actually built the Széchenyi chain bridge, and he married a Hungarian and settled in Hungary. So I have done something a little bit similar, without his distinction, I fear. But anyway, the meeting of cultures is something that interests me, and generally what worries me now about present developments is the identity politics, which are rubbing out much of the tolerance and the interplay between opposing factions, of course, or I would say actually between the passive and silent majority in many cases, and the aggressive new liberal, left liberal ideology, which seems determined to kind of stamp it out, any opposition to their particular ideology.
Now, I want to return to that theme, but for the moment I want to ask about the influence of England on Hungarian history in the 19th century. I mean, it seems to me that that's one of the themes, that there was an extensive borrowing from England by the leading aristocratic reformers who were in politics of the day. First of all, am I right? And secondly, if I am, was that a beneficial trend in the long run?
Obviously, I hope so. But Count Széchenyi, to return to him for a moment, was in fact ardently Anglophile. And he was obviously on the right lines because George Bernard Shaw made some slighting remarks about him. And he came and he wanted to study the development of technology, industrial technology in England, which he believed was urgently required in Hungary. In fact, he was so good at this that he managed to smuggle out the machinery for gas lighting in his Kastély at Danube, which is near the Austrian border, and he did so, I'm glad to say, by bribing the English customs, which rather goes against the English claim of being incorruptible, but fortunately with the right kind of aplomb you could obviously get your way with them. More seriously, he genuinely admired the combination of advancing technology and freedom and basic democracy that he perceived. Maybe a little bit with rosy vision, but he nevertheless perceived England to be some sort of a model. We must also remember that the other great figure, the leader of Hungary in 1848, Kossuth, landed up temporarily in England, arrived at Southampton to much acclaim, and made quite a long speech in completely incomprehensible English, which was very well received, wild applause. Between them, I would say they both had forged a link with England, and possibly the admiration for England could, I say, be a little bit overdone, and it is somewhat, to my chagrin, been somewhat watered down by the results, of course, of world wars, and obviously, perhaps most significantly, by the Treaty of Trianon, which reduced Hungary by 2/3, and also, which some Hungarians believe is an outright betrayal, the Yalta Agreement between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, which marginalized Hungary and put it actually into the Soviet sphere of influence.
And that led, of course, to a long breach, and which ended in 1989. And I wonder whether you see any signs today of an interpenetration of cultural life between England and the English-speaking world, really, and this country, Hungary.
Obviously, there is huge interpenetration simply because of the origin of digital technology and such things that have moved seamlessly into Hungary once the dampening effect of communism was removed. I would say that the English press is almost universally critical of the present government in Hungary, and they tend to rehearse the same complaints. But individual British people are extremely sympathetic, and there are people who come to live here because they find it, and especially, shall we say, Budapest in particular, which has been much renovated and a very pleasant environment in which to live. May possibly be sometimes refugees from the kind of Kulturkampf that I mentioned, which is we'll talk about it probably later, is taking over academe, particularly in both England and America.
And I might add that, of course, the recent history of Hungary has been, two of them have been written by distinguished, one is a distinguished Englishman, Sir Brian Carter, who's the former ambassador, and the other is the late Norman Stone, who was a Scot, of course.
Yes, absolutely. And both of these books, in their different ways, the rather irreverent tone is excellent in Norman Stone, which is, I would say that both of them, but particularly Norman Stone, is in that tradition of history as literature. And this is, to me, perhaps Michelet and a few people like that are other examples, but it is a peculiarly English genre, starting perhaps with Gibbon. And Cartledge's book is also very, very readable and brilliantly written, a change from jargon-ridden treatises where the text is, as they say, a small rivulet between the footnotes.
Perhaps I can now go to some biography. Ilona, you were born in under communism. You've undertaken a successful career as an art critic, cultural critic. I wonder how easy you found it under communism, because your family was not a communist family, and I think may have suffered something for that reason.
It's true. My parents suffered a lot. My father was a surgeon, a professor of medicine, and my mother an X-ray assistant, because in 49, exactly in the year when I was born, she couldn't continue her studies in the University of Medicine because of being middle class origin. Her father was a lawyer. And this was a big blow for my mother. All her life she suffered from it. And my father's career was also stopped for quite a few years because he opposed in 50, I think, when those nurses were thrown out from hospitals who were nuns, you know. And my father didn't want to allow this to happen in his apartment, and he had big clashes with his bosses, who were not professional bosses, but who were party bosses, you know. But I myself was very lucky as a child, because I was the only child, and I got so much love that I could only indirectly feel the fear of my parents. For example, they always told that you should never speak about things what you hear here within the family at school, because there can be a problem for Papa and Mama, you know. So it was a kind of
question at school in the class when you asked about.
Yeah, of course. Sometimes something slipped out, but it was very interesting that in the late 50s and early 60s, when I was a school child, my teachers, generally, the majority of them, didn't agree about so many things in politics, and there was a silent, persistence, but also that alliance between people of middle class origin, or at least that's what I experienced, that they warned my parents that they should take care more about what the child tells and so on, in the primary school, for example. So I myself didn't suffer much, and when I went to university, it was 68. And because of the new mechanism, new economic mechanism in Hungary in the mid-60s, there was a loosening, a kind of politically looser period when there was for a while not a problem if somebody comes from a middle-class family. They wanted to have people also with know-how, with good background. I got privately, with the help of my parents, of course, a very good education. Music especially was very much in the family. But my father came from Transylvania originally. My mother's family from Upper Hungary, that it was referred to, but that was Czechoslovakia. And they were forcibly moved out in 46. You know, so they suffered. It was a late trauma of Trianon again after the Second World War. A new wave of Hungarians had to escape their native land. So I knew all about this, you know, but we learned a totally different history at school. But my school teacher, or actually the professor in the secondary school, had the civil courage to tell us in 63 that put aside your textbook, I will give you lectures, you have to learn how to make notes, and this he told to 14-year-old girls, because in my view history is different. He had the courage then to teach us a different history. Actually, I know now retrospectively that history which came out officially only after the change of 1889-90, you know. So this kind of double interpretation of history was living with me from the first moment on.
So you were arriving at university in the late 60s, early 70s. Things were much easier there at that point, I think. What was, very quickly, can we go on to how you came to meet Nick? Because that was the result of your education and career as a writer on the arts.
Yes, you're right. It was an indirect result of that I studied in the Budapest University history, English, and art history. And I chose art history. Also, I have to tell you why. Because I was taken to the museums from the age 4. Each day, each Sunday, when it was rainy, my parents took me to one of the museums of Budapest. So it was a really thorough education in the visual arts. But it was the most distance from politics. And I didn't want to be a history teacher because I saw the difficulties of it and this double value system, you know. But art seems to be a much freer region, you know, and beautiful. And not that I was diligent, but I had a very big know-how from home on too. So I had always very good marks. And I was taken to the Academy of Sciences immediately after getting my diploma as a PhD student. And for 10 years I worked in the Institute of History of Art. I was quite often ill, and my bosses, so the human network was extremely human in Budapest, you know. And even my bosses with a party book, you know, were very kind to me. They appreciated what you knew, and there was no direct ideological pressure on you. Already in the late 70s and early 80s, maybe because the history of art, the interpretation of the old ages was not in the limelight, you know, naturally. And in the academy you were freer as a scientist, as you would have been in the medias, for example.
But for example, the one reason here, of course, is that this was a period when communists themselves were losing faith in the orthodoxy that enabled them to pontificate about everything from agriculture to surrealism, and so that was, I think, a very significant period to live through, particularly when we look back on it now with the revival of ideas like of socialism and admiration for communism. This was a period when not even communists believed it, did they?
That's true. That's true. People spoke totally differently at home among their intimate friends. Though among those intimate friends there could be people who reported on them. But people were very often more naive, I think. You know, there was a certain higher grade of trust in a way. And in the academy I got scholarships, you know, mainly within the Eastern Bloc. But because I was at one stage very ill, my bosses decided that this child, because even at the age of your late 20s, for them I was a child, should get a scholarship into the Mediterranean, that her lung problems should be solved. And then I got a scholarship to Greece for half a year to study Greek painting and Hungarian painting, to compare them. There are 2 points which are common. Both the Hungarians and the Greek fought the Turks. So in history painting, this is an absolute leitmotif, the battles against the Turks. And both schools, national schools of painting, studied in Munich, in the Munich School of Painting. So there was a fantastic basis and reasoning for that, that I should go to Greece and to study Greek art. And I landed in Essen and went to the Pinakothek. I found about research material enough for 2 weeks, you know, and then I was free after it. And that's where I could meet my husband, who was living in Essen at that time.
Now, anyone who buys your book will find a very funny autobiography essay in the form of light verse, which I strongly recommend. So how was it you found your way to Greece?
Well, I have to confess, I took Maxwell's shilling, the famous, or rather infamous, Robert Maxwell, who decided that he didn't have a list of books for teaching English. And that was perfectly true, as I discovered when I tried to sell his list, which purported to be about teaching English, and there are in fact a large number of what are called frontisteria in Greece, because the national curriculum is considered to be so weak that unfortunate school children are sent, mostly teenagers, to night school, one of which I taught for a while. If I may just explain how we met, it's quite bizarre in some ways. I happen to know someone who worked at the Hungarian commercial consulate, who remained very, very good friends. And they said, oh, well, we must meet his friend, and we'll go to the Pinakothek together to look at the Picasso exhibition. And Ilona gave a very, very distinguished tour for us of this. And we all were quite agog. And then Agi, our friend, said, I wonder if you could just say some of that in English, because next Hungarian is a little bit rusty. I spoke not a single word of Hungarian, of course. Anyway, I noticed that Ilona looked as thin as a sparrow. And I discovered soon that although there was an exchange program and Greek students here were lushed up something wicked to show how wonderful the communist world was and loaded with food and subsidies and so on, unfortunately, Greek bureaucracy being what it is, Ilona couldn't even get access to her bursary, which was dispersed by the Ministry of Finance. And also, when the finance came through, she couldn't get money out of the bank because the banks were on strike. So I scented an opportunity. And from then on, we started, we went to dinner in the taverna, and it went from there.
Yes.
So,
and now, of course, you yourself had a strong interest in the arts. You say you accepted Maxwell's shilling, but in fact you were in publishing.
I was then in publishing, and I had been an editor in a publishing house, and the publishing house was not really going anywhere. It was a subsidiary of another one, actually, of the largest Australian publisher, and I felt that they were going to close the office soon and close me probably even sooner. And so I just thought, well, now for something completely different. And I took this job, I suspect, because nobody else wanted it. After about 6 to 9 months of going around Greece trying to explain to these people that our wonderful books on methodology, the bane of all social sciences now, this was just the thing they needed. And they said, I'm terribly sorry, but what we actually need are texts which we could teach people from. So I wrote to, or sent a fax to my boss saying, I'm afraid I can't sell these books, so you're wasting your money on me. So I resigned, thinking they'd be terribly happy to have got rid of this drone who cost us money and achieved nothing. To my amazement, he faxed back in a panic, saying, no, 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 please stay, the prospects are good, and so on and so forth. And I realized he was simply terrified of forming up to Maxwell and saying, we sent this awful person to Greece, and he's done us no good at all, and he just didn't want to have that on as his responsibility. So he said, stay on for a year, which I did, was very enjoyable. I got my salary, I started writing, and I'm afraid I didn't sell a single book.
But you then went on to write a large
I
number of
started
books.
writing there,
Yeah.
and I had written one book before, well, compiled an anthology just before I left England, which was called Dipped in Vitriol, and was an anthology of Hatchet reviews, a very enjoyable book to compile. And that sort of started me off, because it's with commentary, quotes with commentary on that sort of track. And I read another book called The Joy of Bad Verse, which explores the possibility of the worst possible poets and how this has been no bar to not literary but public success, such as some of the poet laureates in England.
And you've gone on to write guidebooks, but I think more interestingly, in a way, you've gone on to write a guide to guidebooks, how they came to be written, their history, and so on. And guidebooks have never really gone out of fashion, but they're now quite seriously back in high fashion, aren't they?
Not really. The guidebook of the type that I wrote, or tried to write, is basically dying, if not dead. That's to say, I wrote the Blue Guides, and one knows the Guy Bleu and other similar publications. They are not really viable anymore, and they're already dying when I wrote some of the last ones. And what you have instead is highly visual, sort of digitally produced.
So what does that tell us about our modern society? Because I've always understood that guidebooks were an enormously good source for social history. And Baedeker and others, they're seriously a part of developing modern civilization, the way we understand each other across cultures.
Absolutely, and that's what they were. Baedeker, as you say, and the John Murray Guides, which were the two parallel, competing sometimes, and the sort of people who would read those would of course be what the Germans called Bildungsbürgertum, the educated middle class, and I at any rate tried to include in them as much cultural information and history as also a very, very detailed architectural, mostly, or topographical description of the places being visited. Now, they're great fat books, a particular guidebook to Austria, the Blue Guide, which now nobody is going to stagger around with looking at as they once did. The visual element is important because that's how our culture has changed. It's how people also learn from screens. They've got to write an essay on something, they look it up on Wikipedia, and they got all the information in a very short time. In the case of very good, well-produced guides, the Eyewitness, but basically the texts are captions to pictures, visually very striking, beautifully produced, much better quality than any of the illustrations in the sort of books that I wrote. But I did write some of these type of books too, for the AA, for example. But I realized that this was not going to be a profession forever. And then I got very interested after I met Ilona. She was given a bursary at the Getty Center in Los Angeles. And they were very good to spouses, and I went actually as Mr. Thatcher, 2 steps behind. And I discovered that there was a complete collection, which I knew of guidebooks going right back to the 17th century in the library there. They had just bought it up from a German scholar who lived in Florence, a unique source. And so I got into this, as it were, Bakshi, and I realized that nobody had written a description of a history of the guidebook as a literary genre. And so I start actually with the ancient world, but the most important initial chapter is on Pausanias, the famous topographer and guide to Greece. And it ends, if you like, with the rough guide. So it's a big book. Took me about 6 or 7 years to write, if I remember, driving us all mad, of course, as such projects do. But I like to think that it is unique and that nobody else has actually done this. And I obviously tried to make it a cultural history, not just a list of titles and the rest, but what the significance of Pausanias, who was writing under Roman rule, and a kind of attempt to restore and maintain Greek identity under Roman occupation rule.
Hadrian.
But
Under Hadrian.
Hadrian, of course. And the important thing is that in fact there was a mutual recognition there, because the Romans also had inherited so much and admired so much Greek culture, so that they almost said it as a Roman saying that captive Greece has conquered Rome. And that was a recognition that you inherited the culture from elsewhere, or at least its best bits, and the politics of it, as it were separate.
And in fact, a lot of these ideas are obviously under challenge in our modern culture wars.
Yes.
You just mentioned, what you've just described, for example, is now attacked. I'm trying to think of the phrase.
Cultural appropriation.
Cultural appropriation,
yes.
Which means that you're positively discouraged from learning about other cultures, and even more discouraged from using those other cultures to develop your culture of your own. I think both of you would have views on this. I mean, in your view, why has the market for something, the guide to guidebooks, but more generally, the guide for serious cultural and historical criticism, rooted in genuine knowledge of these other cultures, but bringing those cultures to bear on our own lives, why has that market somehow disappeared?
I don't think it's disappeared at the highest level, but I think the problem with cultural appropriation as a slogan is that it tries to suggest that a famously silly example was that people were handing out at one of these freshmen's fairs at Norwich University, they were handing out leaflets for a Mexican restaurant locally and wearing sombreros. Outrage from the Students' Union, this is cultural appropriation. And so the line is that anything like that is insulting to the people who really own the culture, which of course is a very stupid point of view anyway, because we are all, particularly in Europe, a mixture of cultures. I voted for Brexit and I got tired of being told that I was a xenophobe. I spent my life, almost 35 years, in Europe. Either I was at Pisa University very briefly, I lived in Italy and in Greece, and then in Vienna and in Budapest. So the idea that I'm a xenophobe is completely absurd. But I do happen to believe in certain things which those who are against Brexit did not believe in. For example, the nation state and the necessity of preserving it, and sovereignty. These apparently, according to them, are evidence of nativism, xenophobia and of course of racism.
This is, of course, the world in which we're now living. As the three of us sit here, we're reading in the newspapers about these ideas rushing through the United States. We're reading, for example, of how Lana Shriver, the novelist, was actually herself asked to essentially leave a conference because she wore a sombrero to emphasize some point she was making in a speech, yes. After which she was disavowed by the literary conference in, I think, Queensland, and after which the literary conference actually lied about the nature of the invitation they'd sent her. So there is a very curious atmosphere here in which argument, debate, discussion is being driven out of our civilized life by angry and, it seems to me, not very comprehensible ideologies. Where do they come from?
Well, sadly, I think they, to a large extent, now come from, Ilona will have an idea about this, but I think that they have
seeped into... It's an identity crisis.
Yes.
An identity crisis of these people who have problems with their own identities, who can't create a synthesis of being a patriot, being a part of Europe, you know, and embracing all the positive things of the world, you know. And that is always based on very many individual own decisions, you know. And somehow I was teaching 45 years, and I saw that generations of students became more and more different, you know. At first the slogan was a global village. The happiest period of I was teaching at CU, you know, an international,
program.
Flock of students, art history from a cultural historical basis, and the first 10 years were absolutely happy. And there were intermarriages, there were really, we were going around visiting Venice, Vienna, Prague, and so on. And there was no problem about it that somebody is a Czech patriot or somebody is an Italian patriot and so on. And now there came a kind of bad conscience about that you are a nationalist, you know, if you protect your own values, what you herited, you know. They were not taught to harmonize this, to put into the big picture, but as an individual perfect little unit, which has the right to absorb from everywhere the positive values, you know, without losing your core, you know. You speak, even if you speak 7 languages, like my father or like Hevesi, the art critic, spoke, you always have a mother tongue.
Yeah.
Is it a crime to have a mother tongue? No. The mother tongue is your patriotism.
Is it possible to really appreciate, enjoy, and benefit from other cultures if you have a guilty conscience and maybe even hate your own culture, if you have an attitude of almost kind of multicultural masochism towards your own culture? Is that something that distorts everything, all your other responses of a cultural kind?
I see that it is not possible if you don't appreciate what you got from your parents, from your native land. I saw in the students that they get more and more tense and bitter, and they look at the fashion. What's the last cry? What are the real buzzwords? They began to use only those, you know,
slogans
as buzzwords too, you know, because they thought that they will get easier a good career in the international organizations, which have a lot of money, you know, and they became more and more uncertain somewhere in themselves. It's very, very sad, because very many lonely, singular little egos dash round who are everywhere at home. They think, but only they think. They are much more exposed to money.
Well, as a matter of fact, there are 2 essays, Nick, in your book one on fashion, and one on the commodification of culture.
Yeah.
Which I think, Ilona, you had a bad conscience about him doing those at my urging, but I think that they are very significant in this discussion, aren't they?
Could I just add a footnote to what Ilona said, very clear, but I think that there's another factor in this. The problem of subordinating everything to the will to power is that you get this kind of enforced conformity. And in my opinion, there are two routes to it. One is the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, who coined the phrase, in fact it was then used by Rudi Dutschke and popularized the long march through the institutions. And the second was Herbert Marcuse, who coined the phrase repressive tolerance, which is a contradiction in terms. And those ideas have been kind of inserted into the mental world of very many students now, and even if only kind of intuitively, they've also been inserted into education at lower level, unfortunately. And if you look at the way in which these people behave, for example, the intolerance, the no platforming of speakers simply because they disagree with their political or other viewpoint, say on transgender or anything like this, in which distinguished people have been so-called cancelled. Distinguished feminists like Germaine Greer, a pioneer of feminism in England. And this is, in fact, a cult of intolerance. Okay.
Well, and essentially, what we're seeing, the final point of this argument, what seems to be the final point, is a refusal to debate and discuss and perhaps to amend and influence each other's views. That now results in a decision that, rather than being argued with, you have to be silenced because your views are really not worthy of discussion. Now, why do you think these views have become so widely spread in universities and all the major cultural institutions of society? Because they seem to be radically contrary to what people who were professors at universities, editors of magazines
used to believe,
and indeed taught us as a kind of religion when we were growing up.
Well, I think that George Orwell was so percipient about many things. And ironically, it is supposedly the motto of the BBC, which is a kind of betrayal if you see the BBC's output now. But he said if freedom of speech means anything, it means the freedom to say what other people do not wish to hear. And it is the abnegation of that, total abnegation, that has led to the present situation. And I have to say that there's, in my view, a kind of cowardice seems to have entered into academe. A feeling that you must not rock the boat. In some cases, I think Frank Furedi and people have drawn attention to this, the danger of losing your job. There is certainly a danger of losing your job on the New York Times, you see, on areas of journalism. And a typical example, perhaps not typical, an example of this kind of, what I would say, if I'm being very, very censorious, I know, is a kind of moral cowardice. Earlier this week, Timothy Garton Ash, who is a liberal guru, a grandee of liberalism, and he's written a book, I believe, about freedom of speech, and it has many admirable elements. But in this article he wrote in the FT, he said, yes, it's good that these writers have now issued an open letter, which will be published in Harper's Magazine. But then he tails off the last sort of 2 columns of his article. But we should, do these students and people the credit of listening to them. Now, the idea that their views are not on every single social media, the BBC, absolutely daily, liberal media of one kind or another and in academe is of course ridiculous. These people have an enormous forum. But his mistake is to think that they want to listen to us in any shape or form. Their agenda is made quite clear. You topple that statue, there is no argument about it. You accept my view about transgender, if not, you are a transgender phobe, and so on and so forth. Abuse has been substituted for debate and argument. And I'm afraid I think that academe has a very large share of the guilt.
Now I want to turn to Ilona here because is it your impression, it is mine, but it may not be yours, that there is greater resistance in Central and Eastern Europe to these trends in American and English society and in the Western world generally that Nick's just been criticising? There's greater resistance here than there is in the West. Am I right or wrong? And if I'm right, why?
I think you are right. There is greater resistance because formally the people who have memory about the decades under communist socialism had no freedom of speech, and they still remember what it is, and they see with a shock that the new wave is as intolerant as the old regimes were, or sometimes more intolerant.
So, in many cases.
So, in all these states, I think, which were stuck behind the Iron Curtain till 1890, and those who can still remember those times, they realize with a shock that the youth didn't appreciate that fantastic opening up, which brought the first 1.5 decade at least after the Berlin Wall has fallen down. But it's very interesting. Yesterday in Vienna, I heard a program on the Viennese official radio ORF, a debate exactly about this Harper Magazine article, which so many left liberal intellectuals and writers also signed in defense of free speech. The three persons who discussed it, one of them was a very young professor of gender studies who didn't want to realize that this is a real danger, the lack of the freedom of the speech, and always wanted to shift, the goalpost to transgender, to migration issues and so on. Exactly that. She always played on the card of victimhood. And a telephone call to this program, an elderly person, he sounded like a professor, he complained about it, that this new style of discussion is speaking from the position of victim, and they are always in person hurt if some other has a different opinion. And in that moment, they began to attack. And I think behind it is that deeply built truth in human character, that if you are wrong and you feel that you are wrong in something, you become aggressive, And I think somewhere they must feel this.
Can I add a footnote to that, what Ilona was saying? In some respects, ironically, there seemed to be more freedom of thought and speech in late Kantarism. There was a minister of culture called Atsil György, and it translates into English that his attitude to culture was, it is either forbidden, tolerated, or encouraged. So there was a certain bandwidth, if you like. Is that right? Is tiltot?
Yeah, but the tolerated was quite wide.
Yes.
So you could be critical from the still tolerated one too.
Well, I remember bringing over to the United States, to the Heritage Foundation, a professor of politics who'd written a book effectively discussing and praising the works of the American conservative Russell Kirk. And I asked him, how come such a book can be published in Poland? And he replied, well, you have to have a sentence at the beginning saying, these are works of interesting political ideas from a historical standpoint, but have, of course, been disproved by
Totally.
Marxism and Leninism. You have just the same sentence at the end, and they don't mind what you write in between.
Yes.
And I think that, of course, was the signs of an orthodoxy that was withering away and being disbelieved.
Censorship was quite lazy very often.
Yes. Stumpy, yes.
Yeah.
So, but I want to turn from that kind of Marxism in the past and what they call multicultural Marxism today, Gramsciism and so on, to capitalism, because there are two essays in your book, and of course this very much relates to your book as well, and this is the art market under capitalism. In your book, Ilona, you're describing how that was created and shaped by an enterprising journalist. And in your essays on fashion and commodification of art, you're describing how the vibrant, lively, genuine, new debating culture around art and painting and music and literature, with tremendous criticism. You get Bernard Shaw writing about Shakespeare and about Wagner and their lively essays, whether you agree with them or not.
Brahms' Deutsche Requiem could have come from any respectable undertaker.
Well, I always defend Shaw on the grounds that he's lively and entertaining.
Absolutely.
He interests me in these things. But you're also describing what is a kind of a commodification of absurdities in a way.
It is a horrible nexus between political correctness, if you like, and the new commercialism. That is to say, if you go into the Tate Gallery bookshop, and you used to find quite a lot of interesting, and still do, some interesting art volumes and treatises and so on. But you find that about 2/3 of it is now given over to identity, gender studies, gay and queer studies, and so on and so forth.
In the arts.
It is like a kind of image of the way in which the trade of art has kind of sold out to conformist ideas of the kinds we talked about. And of course, the problem about modern art, which Ilona is much better placed to talk about than me, is that it has become something of a conspiracy between dealers. I have a long piece about how the auctions were basically rigged or are rigged. And that's not just my opinion, there's Ben the Grosvenor and people who've written articles about this rather bravely, because I don't expect to be allowed in an auction house again. Partly that, and partly this commodification of everything. And you have a situation where aesthetic tastes and even integrity of art is assumed rather than examined. And you're not going to get very far if you don't conform. There are a few critics who do, but Brian Sewell, who is now no longer with us. And this results in the art being the last reservoir of investment for people who are oligarchs in many cases, and to drive up the prices, and who do not probably know anything about art in its broader sense, because if they're a Russian oligarch, they've probably just stolen the money from some oil company or whatever, and they have advisors who tell them this is the coming thing and you must buy this. In my view, this is all corrupt and corrupting, and it means that there is very little. There are some exceptions, of course, Ilona will tell you, of people who look at these things with a stern critical eye. But generally, anyone who does that can be written off as some sort of reactionary and probably dangerously not politically correct and so on, if they object to this.
One effect of this, it seems to me, as a reader, is that art critics are, by and large, there are exceptions, completely unreadable.
For the average person.
Yes, and they're not writing in a way that conveys an interest in real things. They're stringing together a kind of Meccano-like number of words, which, as you said, emphasize matters which are strictly speaking external to art, but which are now thought to be absolutely central to it. I want to ask two final questions. if I can ask you, Ilona, you ran a very successful, you composed, arranged a very successful exhibition on the art of this period. And you're in a position, it seems to me, to tell us how we can hope to revive a genuine spirit of art and cultural life, something which is both real, attending to the lives we live now, but also obeys certain rules that makes it attractive, gripping to ordinary people. If I were 18 and I were to come to you and say, I want to go into a career in this field, I feel a desperate desire to paint or to write music, where would you suggest I go to learn these things?
My God, it's a very difficult question. When I was teaching 10 years ago, I used to tell my students that one of the most difficult career is to make a career in the art field, in any, I think also in modern music, not only in modern painting. And I wouldn't advise that unless if you have very, very strong nerves, very sharp elbows, and you have a gift to create very quickly a capital of connections, in the art world, then you are hopeless. You can be the greatest talent of the time, but it is the market who decides it, and the media decide it. And not everybody's character is appropriate for that, because not everybody got such a quantum of energy that you can parallelly do the two to manage, to get a very good manager and so on. So I would say, don't go to another field, and now I would tell it even more, but to study. The art schools, for example, also Budapest, are very good because they go back to the basis, and you have to learn anatomy and all the classical studies, because you can't become a great name. You can deny these values, what the old canon meant, but you have to know what you throw away, and you have to have at first a very strong worldview. Without a solid worldview and value system, you will not be able to create something new which tells something to the other people and to the world, So that's the core. You have to have a worldview. You have to be at home somewhere.
Could I add a footnote to that from my own experience? We have a good friend who is very distinguished as keeper of the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, and has written some very important works and really valuable works in art history. And his son, isn't it, has become an art critic. And he said to us the other day, he said, I can't understand a single word of what my son, I am long-standing art historian, so I can't understand a single word. He specializes in critiques of modern art and modern exhibitions. And he said, it could be Arabic, as far as I'm concerned.
Also because the discourse changes so quickly.
Yes.
Because the most important value today is novelty, to bring something which nobody never ever did before. If you have then a good manager, then you make a name. It's not sure that it will last very long, but for a few months or for even a few years, it can work. And if the media pick it up, and if, for example, a Saatchi gives a few billions to it, then you can become famous by putting a shark in formalin, and you will go into the history of art. But that's a special case, you can't repeat it again. Only the same artist can put different animals in formalin, and the museums will buy up because the lobby of the medias build it up as a very important work of art, because there are a lot of very gifted verbal virtuosos who can explain everything if it's new, but they actually ruin the canon. And they ruin something which is substantially belonging to the essence of man.
Well, I think Tom Wolfe said, anticipating or echoing what you just said, that the most important item in any modern exhibition is the catalogue, because people cannot actually get anything from the paintings unless they're explained to them. And it used to be the case that people would say, well, don't ask what it means, just respond to it. They now say the opposite. They say, if it doesn't mean what I want it to mean, it's worthless.
It needs a manifesto, it needs a theory, yes.
But the public is intimidated, you know.
Yes.
They don't want to show that they don't understand it and that they are not au jour. They have to know the last cry.
Well, that's my question to Nick. Nick, your book contains essays on a range of things. There are some political essays there about Brexit, which you've supported, and generally those essays are, I would say, conservative liberal essays or liberal conservative essays. You are yourself, and this is a technical description, not flattery, an old-fashioned man of letters and liberal intellectual. Why do you think that in the arts and culture, as just described by Ilona, but also in politics too, that conservative opinion, including the conservative opinion of highly educated people, is unable to make any resistance, or seemingly so, in Western cultures, to the kind of decay and decadence, indeed, that was just described by Ilona?
Jeremy Black, a historian, said in another podcast I did with the critic the other day, something very interesting. He said, academics, my colleagues, do not regard conservatism as a political stance or attitude, still less ideology. They regard it as a pathology. And it is from this side that the whole idea of conservatism has been attacked very successfully. If one takes it back to Hevesi, some very interesting questions that I learned from reading Ilona's articles about Hevesi. And one was the question we talked about modernism. And Hevesi, correct me if I'm wrong, maintained originally that historicism, which is very much not in fashion but was represented in Ilona's exhibition, was itself modern at the time it was produced. This is a simple point, but it seems curiously difficult for people to grasp. So the second point is also the canon. The canon used to be constructed, I think, as in literature, by a mixture of the readers' or viewers' responses amalgamated with a so-called expert response, or an aesthetician or an art critic who perhaps knew something about the technicalities as well. That doesn't really seem to me to exist anymore, and all kinds of canons are suspect because the whole attitude to history must conform to the left liberal ideology, history in the broader sense. So you now have, for example, anybody who points out that the British Empire had some very dark sides to it and atrocities, of course, a few, but overall you could also make a case that it contributed a great deal. And Churchill was asked, who was a supporter of British imperialism, I hope that the point of the British in India is to bestow a measure of justice in governance. No historian now, except there are very few whom both of us know, can actually say such a thing and not provoke an outraged and bullying, I would say bullying letter, that then appears in, say, in the Times immediately afterwards. And of course the implication is always the same: you're a racist, you're this, that and the rest. So this attitude, I had to go back to it, it seeped in through education, and in my view it trickles down from the top, from the 1968ers, who are of course now in power in many cases, have political power, and who gradually usurped any more balanced view of the old culture. And of course history and the social sciences are very much, I would say, not even under threat. They've basically been taken over. No, history is not quite true, because there are still some brave voices who stand out against it, but then they're diminishing and threatened minority.
You want to come back?
Yes, I wanted to tell something, it got to my mind about history. History is an unwanted burden for the new generations, I think.
Yeah.
The world was globalized. It has different histories in different continents, And somehow in the last 30 years, when the world was really globalized, it seemed to be that it's nearly the end of history of this process, These last 30 years was unable to find a relatively common, tolerant platform that this new world, which is a global village, let's say, should endure the different traditions, the local different traditions. So they began to muscle out those traditions which the previous generation, because there is also a generational riot in it, the sons always want to do something else what the fathers did, Sometimes with justice, sometimes not, But I think that this, together with the digitalization of the world, which changed nearly physiologically the perception of the world for the new generations, they are much quicker and so on, but it's more shallow, that everything became really visualized, but those visual images disappear as quickly as possible, and they extinguish each other, and they also feel the lack of the deeper knowledge which builds up their inner value system, to which I would like to refer all the time, and the common denominator becomes only a kind of empty freedom and your physiological body. That's why body art became so very important, for example.
It's identity politics taken over into culture.
Yeah, but they want to start from now and to solve the problems from now and to nivelize the whole world on this state where it is, but the continents are different, their traditions are different, and what's the most dangerous, that their mentality is different, Their concept about the family and the concept about the gender is different on different continents, and different cultures, I would say. These cultures hate that what was called European civilization. In spite that it was European civilization, and you can call it as an empire, but it's not necessarily an empire, but the general North Atlantic civilization which globalized the world and for a few decades could control it. The control is hated, The traditions were not internalized, which is a positive tradition actually. And what remains? Your single hurt ego, which doesn't feel at home in this world.
But also the exploitation, therefore, of victimhood. Everything has to be looked through the lens of victimhood. And if you think also what the West brought to the rest of the world, many, many advances, medicine, so on, from which everybody has benefited. But of course, I have also to say that it brought Marxism to large slices of the world. And that has not been very beneficial. It usually produces just tyrants and corrupt dictators.
And it touches the issue of democracy. Yes. Plato was very pessimistic about it, that you can have democracy only in a small local society, Now, how to extend democracy over the whole globe when we are about 9 million people, how many we are? I don't know.
We can expand.
It's very difficult.
No, we can only expand it in a sense, nation by nation. You can't expand it in everything. You've just both given two very pessimistic replies. So I want.
We are elderly.
No. I mean, but I want to therefore ask this question. Nick, you were, in a sense, saying that. In both the intelligentsia and I think the wider middle class that used to be the audience for paintings, music, literature, even if it was middle brow, it was often very good culture, they have not shown the kind of stomach to nerve to resist these things, and they need resistance, they can't just be ignored. So I therefore turn to an author you've quoted already, to the last page, actually, of Orwell's 1984.
Yeah.
And at one point, Winston Smith says, it's almost the end of the book, I think, he says, if there was any hope at all, it lay in the proles, the proletariat, the workers. I would have thought there's some evidence for that in the Brexit story, which is a political resistance. But is there any hope in a broader sense from the proles for resistance to these trends across the system? Or are they just going to be diverted by a different kind of pap?
Well, shall I start on that?
I hope that there is.
Ilda's Hungarian, she's a bit of a pessimist. I would just say that in fact there is always hope. But I do remember when I was at Oxford, which I'm afraid was many years ago now, and Robert Graves, the poet, came, who was a marvellous old pagan, as you know, and he was very dry, and the student put his hand up and said, do you think, Mr. Graves, from some of your writings I think maybe you think this, do you think that our civilization is collapsing? And he said, no, it's imploding.
Well, that's the conclusion that's suggested by many other writers. Toynbee, for example, civilizations, when they die, die by their own hand.
Yes.
I think that whether it's true or not, we have to act as if it's false.
Yes.
And I think you are both doing that very plainly, and I think in a modest way, heroically. So I want to thank you for coming on and giving us a fascinating opportunity to listen to your views. I also want to recommend very strongly both books. I, of course, am only able to read, to look at the pictures in Ilona's book for the moment, but I know her writings in English too from the magazine. But I think your book of essays, Nick, is absolutely essential reading for anyone who wants to maintain hope, not because you're particularly hopeful in the books, but because you are devastatingly accurate and destructive of the nonsenses that we are now having to live through, and very often having to applaud as well. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.